It gives me great pleasure to... We'll pause for a hug. Always got time for a hug. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to James Shaw, co-leader of the Green Party. Come on up, James.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good evening, Christchurch. You all feel quite a long way away, so haere mai. I've got to get my brain back working now because that was the first time I've ever driven a Tesla, and it's my regular is a Hyundai Ioniq, which I have to say I love. This is different in a lot of very good ways, and very exciting to ride. So I really want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much for coming out tonight as well. It's great to see you and good to see so many people who are really enthusiastic about decarbonising our transport system and flipping our fleet over from the ancient and polluting internal combustion engine vehicle and over to electrics and hydrogens. So last Tuesday, the Green Party launched our transport package for this coming election. And it's thank you very much. An all-you-can-eat transport policy. It covers regional commuter rail, which is the first time that we've taken that approach, which we're really excited about extending that out. More of the traditional inner city walking and cycling, and also the rapid transit networks that we've got to get operating through our cities, which we've campaigned on for a long time. A cycle superhighway fund to get some proper infrastructure in place to really start to mode shift people for those sort of 5 to 10k journeys and so on. An all-you-can-eat transport card that'll work on any mode of transport anywhere in the country. So whether you're taking the train or whether you want to get on a hire scooter or a EV car share or a bus or a light rail or an intercity commuter rail, the idea is that everyone will have a Go Anywhere card that you can use anywhere in the country to get on any of those modes. And of course, the idea of changing out our fleet. And that's a really big one. So on that one, some of it's been pretty well advertised previously. We went into the last election campaign talking about a fee bait, and quite famously, Julianne Gent, my colleague, did a lot of work in government on exactly that, and somehow we just didn't quite get it over the line, but all the policy work's been done, and so that should be ready to go straight after the election. We are going into it with a slightly modified version of what we had taken to Cabinet, so it's actually a bigger discount for the most efficient vehicles, paid for by just a marginally higher fee on the most polluting vehicles when they come out. Also twinned with vehicle emission standards, because we are basically the last country on the planet not to have vehicle emission standards, which is astonishing. But the new thing that we're intending to do, which we've not talked about before, and that's largely because of information that's kind of arisen in the 3 years since the last election, is that from 2030, we will require that all imports coming into the country will be zero emission. And the reason for that is obvious, climate change. But the United Kingdom and California, and a couple of other countries as well, have actually said that there will be a date after which you cannot even buy an internal combustion engine vehicle inside their country. So the UK originally set it for 2040, then they said, well, maybe it should be 2035, and then they're like, maybe it should be 2032, and now their Climate Change Commission is saying actually it should be 2030. So we think that by Christmas they'll have announced that you won't even be allowed to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle in the United Kingdom after the year 2030. Now what that means is that there'll be 70 million second-hand, right-hand drive internal combustion engine vehicles going cheap. And we don't want them. Because if we do, we will have no hope at all of being able to decarbonise our transport system and to meet our own goals for staying within that threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming. So we're actually going to create an anti-dumping law that says that actually we don't want other people's second-hand dirty discards. The flip side of that, of course, is that we're going to have to do the same thing as well, because if once we start to flip our fleet, we don't want to be exporting our second-hand internal combustion engine vehicles to other countries. We've got to work out a way to fully recycle and reutilize all the amazing materials that are in those vehicles. And so, I think for the first time, actually, we're able to go into an election with a thoroughly thought-through plan for completely decarbonising our transport system in New Zealand. Massive mode shift for both people and freight, for all of the journeys that make sense, and really focusing not on that question of how do we get more cars around, but how do we get more people and freight around in the most efficient way possible. And of course what that means is actually utilising the roads that we have much more effectively, and decongesting them for all of those people who do need to be taking trips using private vehicles and so on. So I am really excited about it, and I know that there's a lot of people in the Greens who get very excited about transport, but it's one of the only times that I've actually had people walk up to me in the street and say that they've changed their vote because of our transport policy, because it's big enough and bold enough and exciting enough that people are saying, actually, this is the thing that I really want to see. So I'm really pleased at the kind of reception that it's getting, not just within my green bubble, but actually out there with kind of voters, which is, of course, what this is all about. So, look, I really want to thank the guys here at EV City for making the facility available, for giving me a spin. That was exciting and motivational, to say the least. And thank you all for coming out. What would you like to do from here?
Do you want to do questions?
Yes.
Yep, cool.
Yeah.
So 4 questions, like I said before, we'll just go around.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because actually in our related policy package on clean energy, we are looking at subsidy packages for rooftop solar plus battery plus the EV charger in people's garages, because we know that one of the resistance points for people buying an EV is that kind of concern about, well, where will I charge it? Of course, the perfect answer is at home. Now, sorry, the import thing is only on internal combustion engine vehicles. So you're absolutely right. Second-hand EVs and hydrogen or other zero-emission vehicles, we want those desperately, lots of them. So we'd be very keen to do anything we can to support those. Yeah. So we're going to retain the road user charge exemption for zero-emission vehicles for as long as it takes to get to 2% of the fleet. We're actually going to extend it to heavy vehicles. So one of the things that we need to do is to decarbonise our freight and buses, intercity buses. We've invested in this term of government in supporting a minimum viable hydrogen refuelling network for trucks, which is going to be largely in the North Island to start with, but there'll be a South Island leg to that over the next few years. And coupled with that, zero-emission trucks will get the road user charge exemption as well. And the combination of those two things means that we should start to see quite a big flip of the freight fleet over to largely hydrogen vehicles over the course of the coming years as well. And that is important, right? Because trucks make up 2% of the fleet, but 20% of the emissions profile. So it's quite a small intervention in terms of the number of vehicles, but a huge impact on our emissions profile if we can tackle that. Ultimately, of course, once we've converted a decent portion of the fleet over to EVs, we're actually going to have to think about the road user charge anyway, because of course it's a price on petrol. And if no one's buying petrol anymore, we're still going to need to pay for our roads. So all of that's going to have to get looked at anyway at some point. Yeah, so we want to lead by example and to leverage essentially our purchasing power to bring in EVs and to move them into the second-hand market as fast as possible. That's actually been slower progress than we were hoping. We were originally intending to have all government vehicles over to zero emission by 2025. And what's actually happened, it's sort of one of those things where it's kind of slowed down, but because of something that's quite useful, is that as we've gotten into conversations with each of our government agencies about their vehicle fleets, they've started to think about actually, do they need vehicle fleets? And so a number of them are actually rethinking their whole fleet strategy. And so yes, they're getting rid of their internal combustion engine vehicles, but some of them just aren't replacing them with vehicles. So in a number of places, they're, for like a lot of the public services based in Wellington, for example, I know that there's a couple of agencies that are looking at using car share services like Mevo, or giving their staff e-bikes rather than cars, those sort of things as well. So I think much of that work has now been done, and we should start to accelerate that the uptake of the replacement cars soon. But the big ones for us are going to be things like the DHBs and others where, I think we've got something like, if I'm right, 64,000 vehicles in total. But each agency makes its own purchasing decisions, and so we've kind of got to go to each of them individually. It's not one of those things that we can just flick a switch on, sadly. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, originally it was the Ministry of Transport that pitched us the idea that you would have an import end date for internal combustion engine vehicles, because they said of all of the other policies that you're looking at, that they whether it's a price signal or through regulation of the vehicle emissions and so on, those are quite complicated. But actually saying that, well, there is a date here that the industry can that'll actually be quite simple and straightforward for the industry to respond to, and so they will simply start managing down the import of internal combustion engine vehicles and ramping up the alternatives to kind of meet that date. I mean, New Zealand, of course, I know you will know this, but we have a peculiar market in the sense that we don't manufacture our own vehicles. The vast majority of vehicles that are bought in New Zealand are second-hand vehicles, and so we're kind of at the end of the value chain, and so we're heavily reliant on the markets in other countries to be able to do anything really with our own fleet, and that's why working with countries like the UK, states like California, countries like Japan and Korea that are making some quite aggressive moves, that we need to act in concert with them. And as Climate Change Minister, one of the things I've talked a lot about is the relationship between our trade arrangements and what we're trying to do with climate, because ultimately we're only going to be able to do this if we really focus our trade efforts on environmental goods and services that help us to all get towards a lower emission future. Okay, so on the first question about what do you do with all those internal combustion engine vehicles that nobody in the world wants anymore, we are basically going to have industrial scale reprocessing. Now, the more recent vehicles are actually, many of them are designed with that in mind, right? So BMW, for example, when they manufacture a vehicle, something like 90% of it is recyclable, reusable, reprocessable materials. So they've actually designed the vehicle to be disassembled and to be reused and reprocessed in the first place. But of course, older vehicles or vehicles manufactured by less enlightened manufacturers than BMW, don't have that facility. But your average vehicle these days has an astonishing array of precious heavy metals, kind of basic metals and so on. And so they're actually quite valuable in terms of their raw materials at the very least. And so I think we're going to have to work with our trading partners to develop essentially a recycling industry around those vehicles. In relation to the National Party's EV policy, so there were some basics there. They said that they wanted to set a target of, I think, 85 or 84,000 vehicles on the road by 2025. Actually, that's business as usual. So that target will be met with no intervention at all. because that is actually the rate at which the fleet is currently doubling. So I thought that was cute, but it's not really a policy because it's just going to happen, right? It's going to happen anyway. And in fact, it needs to be, if you're actually concerned about climate change, then it needs to be far more aggressive than that in terms of uptake. The other thing that they were proposing to try and incentivise it were things like allowing electric vehicles to use bus lanes, and we're not huge fans of that because essentially all it does is it moves the congestion into the bus lane, which is the whole point of having a bus lane is that it has no congestion and allows the bus kind of free reign there. So if that was going to work, it would only work for a very short period of time because it relies on there being very few EVs on the road for it to make any sense. The moment there's any numbers of EVs on the road, then you just end up with another traffic lane and your buses are stuck in traffic again. So yeah, and then I think the road user charge exemption, and I think basically every party in Parliament has signed up to that idea that we'll keep that in play until it does the trick that it's designed to do. Yeah.
Can you also address the French vehicle tax exemption?
Yeah, so we actually we went into 2017 with a fringe benefit tax exemption on EVs as part of our policy. We actually, when we investigated it, of course, fringe benefit tax applies to company cars and not to consumer vehicles, and so we actually went down the fee-bait route, the clean car discount, as a better option because it applies both to fleet vehicles and to consumer vehicles. And so there isn't a need to do both of those because they would have the same effect in terms of the price incentive. Well, so it was New Zealand First that killed that off, killed off the fee-bait. And they're not going to be there, so that's less of a problem. You don't have to get agreement from a party that doesn't exist. Now, National at the time, Todd Muller, who was their climate change spokesperson at the time, and Chris Bishop, who was their transport spokesperson, when we announced it, endorsed it, but they were, Chris was overseas, and he didn't see that Simon had come out against it. This is when Simon was the leader. And so they clearly hadn't talked. But I think that, there's a level of agreement there for it. Yeah. But ultimately, I think it is one of those things that once it's in place, it's not going to get dismantled, right? Because it will really start to shift things. So I think it's one of those things sometimes opposition parties are oppositional for the sake of being oppositional, but once something changes and the next time they get into government, they kind of forget that they were oppositional about it when it came in. So I'm not too worried about that. I do know that it did have a real effect, a negative effect on sales because we thought that we were going to get it through. And of course, because we're a fairly transparent system of government, you want to tell people what you're doing and consult on it, so you couldn't not do that. But we honestly thought we were going to get it, and then Winston pulled it right at the very end, right at the very last minute, which is pretty frustrating. Well, I don't think everyone around the world has thought it through, but definitely there are people who are working on that. And I know that, when it comes to cobalt and lithium, which are the two big things, both of which, by the way, have some pretty horrendous stories in their supply chains, which are, which we're going to need to deal with. That people are looking at alternatives for battery technology, and those things are moving very rapidly. So I have a level of faith that we will get to where we need to get to on that by the time we get there, if you see what I'm saying. I think. Go for it.
This is the Christchurch EV guy. So in terms of lithium, it's actually mostly a byproduct. The worst thing about lithium is the amount of water usage that it consumes to make lithium, basically, and the amount of land area that it takes up. But in terms of humanity issues, it's not as much of a problem with lithium. That's more related to Congo and the cobalt. There is about between 3 and 30% of cobalt comes from mines that aren't fully using ethical manufacturing processes. And all of the mainstream manufacturers, from Nissan to Tesla, have all committed and signed agreements not to use any of that non-ethical cobalt. And what they're actually doing is they're working through their supply lines to ensure that there isn't anyone saying, oh yes, this is ethical cobalt, and then they find out that it's not. So that was always the intention, and they sort of realised that they had to actually go back through and verify all of the supply chains were fine. And then the other thing that we're seeing from battery manufacturers such as Tesla is that they now have batteries that they are working on, that they're producing that use no cobalt. And obviously cobalt is expensive. Less cobalt means less money. So future batteries will, as fast as they can ramp that up, not use cobalt, both for the humanitarian reasons, but also from the price savings. So it's kind of a two driver there. And the last part of that question, I would say, is that without sort of driving the demand for electric vehicles, we're not going to have manufacturers ramp up that supply. The only way to actually have people produce these cars is for them to believe that they can sell them, and for them to believe that they have to actually do it. We have a case in 1980 of people saying no one's either going to have their own computer because it takes up the size of a room. Same way today, you're going to have people saying there's no possible way for us to make batteries because people don't want batteries. The head of BMW has said in private conversations that they don't think that people want electric vehicles. So policies like this and policies from governments around the world to actually drive forward demand for electric vehicles is going to help build that demand and actually make manufacturers put in the resources to develop that. But I'll stop taking over.
No, not at all. No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, it is pushing the innovation envelope extraordinarily. So, you know, advanced materials labs, you know, all over the world, including at Victoria University. You know, I've been talking to people there about the innovations that they're putting into new battery technology, because everyone knows that if you're going to decarbonise the entire economy, not just transport, we're going to need, to paraphrase, we're going to need a bigger battery.
So I think we might wrap up very soon for questions, but James might stick around for any non-related EV questions. But did we have anything else specifically on EVs that we want to?
Let's find out after the election.
So it's a hopeful thing.
Well, it's one of our top priorities, and I think given that, I think the logic is pretty relentless, right? I mean, if you don't say that you're going to have that requirement, there is an argument that says that New Zealand is already being used as a dumping ground for inefficient second-hand internal combustion engine vehicles, and so I think the argument's pretty compelling. And that given that other territories are moving further than what we're proposing and faster than what we're proposing, I don't think that we'll have too much trouble. It's reasonably easy to get people's heads around the idea of something like that takes place 10 years in the future. It will have an immediate impact, but we'd have a lot more resistance if we said it was going to be in the life of the next Parliament.
All right, thank you very much, James.
That's a political reality.